Before we begin this incredible story, please subscribe and hit that like button. These historical investigations require extensive research through cryptographic archives, intelligence records, and declassified documents that have only recently become available. Your support helps us continue bringing you these extraordinary untold stories from World War II. Now let's explore one of the most disturbing mysteries in the history of military intelligence. The spring of 1943 marked a turning point in World War II. The tide was beginning to shift in favor of the Allies. Victories in North Africa, the turning of the Battle of the Atlantic, increasing Allied air superiority over Europe. But wars are won not just on battlefields, but in the shadows, where intelligence services fight invisible battles that determine the outcomes of visible ones. Cryptography, the art and science of codes and ciphers, had become one of the most critical weapons of the war. The ability to read enemy communications while protecting your own gave strategic advantages that could mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. At Bletchley Park in England, brilliant minds worked around the clock-breaking German codes, giving Allied commanders insights into enemy plans and capabilities. In Washington, American cryptographers performed similar work, cracking Japanese codes that would prove decisive in the Pacific theater. It was a war fought with mathematics, logic, and intellectual brilliance, where victories were measured not in territory captured, but in messages decrypted and secrets revealed. But in April 1943, something happened that shook the confidence of Allied intelligence services and created a mystery that remains partially unsolved even 80 years later. It began with an intercepted German transmission that seemed ordinary at first, but revealed itself to be something far more disturbing, a message that would cause Allied units to disappear from communication networks, create paranoia throughout intelligence communities, and raise questions about whether the Germans had developed capabilities far beyond what Allied analysts had believed possible. This is the story of Operation Phantom, though that name was applied only decades later by historians trying to make sense of fragmentary records. At the time, it had no official designation because acknowledging its existence would have meant admitting that something had gone terribly, inexplicably wrong. The story begins at a signals intelligence station designated Site 7, located in the English countryside approximately 40 miles from London. Site 7 was one of dozens of listening posts scattered across Britain, equipped with radio receivers that continuously monitored German military frequencies, recording transmissions that would be sent to Bletchley Park for analysis and decryption. The work was tedious. Operators sat for hours wearing headphones, listening to static, Morse code, encrypted voice communications, searching for anything unusual or significant. Most of what they heard was routine: position reports, supply requests, weather observations, the mundane communications necessary for any military force to function. But occasionally, they'd intercept something important: troop movement orders, strategic plans, intelligence that could save Allied lives and change the course of battles. On the night of April 12, 1943, at approximately 23:17 hours, Operator First Class Margaret Holloway was monitoring frequency 6. 2 megahertz, a band commonly used by German signals units in France. She'd been on duty for 6 hours, her shift nearly over, fatigue making concentration difficult. But training and discipline kept her alert, and when a new transmission began, something about it immediately caught her attention. The signal was strong, much stronger than typical German tactical communications, suggesting a high-powered transmitter, possibly at a major headquarters. But more unusually, the structure of the transmission was different from standard German military communications. German signals typically followed rigid protocols, standard preambles, properly formatted message headers, encrypted content using the Enigma cipher machine that Bletchley Park had learned to break. This transmission had none of those characteristics. The message began with what sounded like a standard Morse code preamble, but the pattern was wrong. The timing between elements was irregular. The rhythm didn't match German standard procedure. Then came the encrypted content, but it didn't sound like Enigma encryption. Enigma produced a characteristic pattern of apparent randomness that experienced operators could recognize. This encryption sounded different. The intervals between characters were inconsistent. The overall rhythm was strange, almost organic rather than mechanical. Holloway, with 3 years of experience monitoring German communications, had never heard anything quite like it. She immediately flagged the transmission as unusual and ensured that it was being recorded in its entirety for later analysis. The transmission lasted 7 minutes and 42 seconds, much longer than typical tactical messages. When it ended, Holloway made detailed notes about the signal characteristics, the unusual patterns she'd observed, her assessment that this was something requiring immediate attention from cryptographic specialists. The recording was couriered to Bletchley Park the following morning, marked as priority but not yet recognized as the beginning of something that would shake Allied intelligence to its core. At Bletchley Park, the recording was initially assigned to Hut 8, the section responsible for breaking German naval Enigma codes. But the cryptographers there quickly determined that this wasn't Enigma encryption at all. It was something else entirely. The message was passed to a special research section that handled unusual or non-standard encryption systems, where a team led by Dr. Eleanor Whitmore began detailed analysis. Whitmore was a mathematician from Cambridge, 31 years old, brilliant and methodical, with expertise in number theory and cryptographic analysis. She'd been at Bletchley Park since 1940, contributing to numerous breakthroughs, developing techniques that had saved countless lives by giving commanders advance warning of German operations. If anyone could decipher this unusual message, it would be Whitmore and her team. The first challenge was determining what encryption system had been used. Standard cryptographic analysis begins by examining the statistical properties of the encrypted text, letter frequency, patterns, repetitions, looking for clues about the underlying plain text and the method used to encrypt it. But this message resisted standard analysis. The statistical properties were unusual, showing patterns that didn't match known encryption systems. The letter frequencies were too uniform, suggesting sophisticated encryption designed to eliminate the statistical weaknesses that cryptographers typically exploited. But there were also anomalies, certain sequences repeated at irregular intervals, patterns that seemed meaningful but whose significance wasn't immediately clear. Whitmore's team worked around the clock, applying every analytical technique they knew. They tested whether it might be a variation of Enigma with modified settings. They investigated whether it could be a one-time pad, a theoretically unbreakable encryption system where each character is encrypted using a random key used only once. They explored whether it might be a mechanical cipher system like the German Lorenz cipher used for high-level communications. Nothing fit. The message remained opaque, refusing to yield its secrets despite the application of brilliant minds and sophisticated mathematical techniques. After 3 days of intensive analysis, Whitmore made a breakthrough, though it was a disturbing one. She noticed that certain sequences in the message matched, with slight variations, sequences that had appeared in previous German transmissions that had already been decrypted. It was as if the message contained fragments of known German communications embedded within the larger encrypted text. This was highly unusual. Typically, encrypted messages are self-contained, with no relationship to other messages beyond perhaps using the same encryption system. But this message seemed to be referencing, incorporating, or somehow connecting to previous German communications in ways that made no cryptographic sense. Working from this observation, Whitmore began treating the message not as a single encrypted text, but as a composite, multiple layers of meaning, some encrypted, some possibly plain text, some perhaps references to other communications. It was cryptographically bizarre, violating normal principles of secure communication. But as she pursued this approach, patterns began to emerge. Certain sections of the message, when decoded using fragments from previous German transmissions as keys, produced readable German text, not complete sentences, but fragments, words, phrases, partial messages that seemed to relate to Allied operations. And that's when the analysis became truly disturbing. The decoded fragments contained references to specific Allied units, operations, and communications that the Germans should not have known about. There were references to British commando operations in Norway, to American naval movements in the Mediterranean, to French resistance activities in occupied France, all operations that were classified, whose details were known only to limited circles within Allied command structures. The message appeared to be demonstrating German knowledge of Allied secrets, showing off intelligence penetration, proving that German intelligence services had sources deep within Allied organizations. But even more disturbing were the timestamps embedded in some of the decoded fragments. These referenced Allied operations that hadn't happened yet, events scheduled for days or weeks in the future. It was as if the message was predicting Allied actions, or perhaps instructing German forces on how to respond to Allied operations that were still in the planning stages. Whitmore documented her findings in a report that she personally delivered to the director of Bletchley Park, Commander Edward Travis, on April 18, 1943. Her report concluded with an assessment that was both professional and deeply worried. This transmission represents either an unprecedented intelligence penetration of Allied operations, or it is a sophisticated deception operation designed to create confusion and paranoia within Allied intelligence services. In either case, it requires immediate and extensive investigation at the highest levels. Travis convened an emergency meeting of senior intelligence officials from British intelligence services, American OSS representatives stationed in London, and military officers responsible for operational security. The meeting was held in a secure facility in London on April 20, 1943, and the discussion was intense and alarming. If the Germans had sources providing detailed information about Allied operations, those sources needed to be identified and neutralized immediately. But how had the penetration occurred? Allied security procedures were rigorous, compartmentalized, designed to prevent exactly this kind of comprehensive intelligence breach. For the Germans to have the breadth of knowledge suggested by the intercepted message, they would need multiple sources at high levels across multiple Allied organizations, a scenario that seemed almost impossible, yet appeared to be supported by the evidence. The decision was made to launch an immediate investigation, codename Operation Bridgewater, to identify potential German intelligence sources within Allied organizations. Simultaneously, security protocols were enhanced, communication procedures were changed, and specific operations mentioned in the decoded fragments were either canceled or significantly modified. If the Germans knew about these operations, executing them as planned would mean sending Allied personnel into ambushes and traps. Better to sacrifice the operational objectives than to sacrifice the lives of soldiers, sailors, and agents who would be walking into German hands. And then, on April 23, 1943, something extraordinary and terrifying happened. Allied units across multiple theaters of operation began disappearing from communication networks. It started with a British commando unit operating in Norway. They missed a scheduled communication check, then another, then fell completely silent. Search efforts were initiated, but the unit had vanished without trace. Then a French resistance cell that had been in regular contact with British intelligence suddenly went dark, failing to respond to multiple attempts at communication. Over the next 72 hours, similar incidents occurred with disturbing frequency. American intelligence assets in North Africa stopped reporting. A Royal Navy submarine operating in the Mediterranean missed 3 consecutive scheduled communications. Allied agents in occupied Europe, who had been providing valuable intelligence, disappeared from the communication networks as if they'd never existed. The pattern was clear and horrifying. The units and individuals disappearing were the same ones that had been referenced in the decoded fragments of the mysterious German transmission. It was as if the message had been a death sentence, and now that sentence was being carried out with methodical precision. Allied intelligence services faced a crisis. Were these units being captured by German forces who'd been alerted by the mysterious transmission? Were they being eliminated by German agents who'd identified them through the intelligence penetration? Or was something else happening, something that defied conventional explanation? The investigation intensified. Security services interrogated personnel, reviewed procedures, searched desperately for evidence of German penetration. But nothing was found. No moles were identified. No procedural breaches were discovered. The security apparatus appeared intact, yet somehow the Germans had obtained detailed information about Allied operations and were using that information to devastating effect. The psychological impact on Allied intelligence personnel was severe. If there were German sources within Allied organizations that couldn't be identified despite intensive investigation, how could anyone trust their colleagues? How could operations be planned if the Germans might know about them before they were executed? Paranoia spread. Cooperation became difficult. Efficiency dropped as people became afraid to share information even with those who legitimately needed it. Dr. Whitmore, meanwhile, continued analyzing the original transmission, searching for any additional insights that might explain what was happening. And she made another disturbing discovery. Using increasingly sophisticated analytical techniques, she found that the message contained what appeared to be embedded instructions, not just intelligence about Allied operations, but specific directives for German forces on how to respond to those operations. More disturbingly, some of these instructions seemed to relate to operations that were unfolding in real time as units were disappearing from Allied communication networks. It was as if the message had been a comprehensive operation order, providing German forces with detailed information about Allied activities and specific guidance on how to neutralize those activities. But the most bizarre aspect of Whitmore's analysis related to the structure of the message itself. The encryption system, while sophisticated, wasn't actually more advanced than systems the Germans were known to possess. What was unusual was how the message had been constructed. The way it incorporated fragments from previous communications, the temporal references to future events, the layered structure that required understanding multiple contexts to fully decrypt. Whitmore began to suspect that the message wasn't simply an intelligence report or an operation order. It was something more complex. Perhaps a test of Allied cryptographic capabilities, perhaps a psychological warfare operation designed to create exactly the kind of paranoia and confusion that was now spreading through Allied intelligence services. She wrote in her analysis notes, later declassified in 1998, the message's structure suggests a level of sophistication in both cryptography and psychological operations that exceeds what we've previously attributed to German intelligence services. It's possible we've underestimated their capabilities. It's also possible that this represents a new approach to intelligence warfare, using cryptographic methods not just to conceal information, but to actively manipulate enemy decision-making and create organizational paralysis through uncertainty and distrust. By early May 1943, the crisis had deepened. 17 Allied units or individual agents had gone silent, representing a significant loss of intelligence-gathering capability and operational effectiveness. Allied commanders faced impossible decisions: continue with planned operations despite the risk that Germans knew about them, or cancel operations and surrender initiative to the enemy. The morale implications were severe. Personnel in intelligence and special operations units understood that their colleagues had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, that there appeared to be a German intelligence capability that couldn't be countered, that each mission might be compromised before it began. Then, on May 7, 1943, a second mysterious German transmission was intercepted, this one from a different location, on a different frequency, but with similar unusual characteristics. The cryptographic team at Bletchley Park analyzed it with the techniques they'd developed while studying the first message and made rapid progress in decryption. And what they found was astonishing. The message appeared to be a German intelligence assessment of Allied reactions to the first transmission and the subsequent disappearance of Allied units. It described Allied investigation efforts, mentioned specific security changes that had been implemented, even referenced the existence of Operation Bridgewater, the code name for the investigation that had been highly classified and known only to a small circle within Allied intelligence services. This was the confirmation everyone had feared. The Germans had sources within Allied intelligence at the highest levels. How else could they know the code name of a highly classified investigation? How else could they have detailed knowledge of security changes and investigation procedures? But once again, despite intensive investigation, no sources could be identified. The British security services launched their most extensive internal investigation since the beginning of the war. Personnel were interrogated, backgrounds were re-examined, communication procedures were analyzed in minute detail. Nothing was found. The German intelligence penetration, if it existed, was so sophisticated and so well concealed that it was effectively undetectable. An alternative theory began to gain traction among some analysts, though it seemed almost as disturbing as the idea of undetectable German penetration. Perhaps there was no penetration. Perhaps the Germans were using sophisticated deception techniques, feeding false information through channels they controlled, creating the appearance of comprehensive intelligence knowledge when in reality their knowledge was much more limited. Perhaps the mysterious transmissions were elaborate psychological warfare operations designed not to communicate real intelligence, but to make the Allies believe their security had been compromised, to create exactly the kind of paranoia and organizational paralysis that was now occurring. This theory would explain why investigators couldn't find evidence of German penetration, because no penetration existed. It would explain the bizarre cryptographic structure of the messages, because they were designed to be partially decrypted in ways that would maximize psychological impact. It would even explain how the Germans appeared to have foreknowledge of future Allied operations. Perhaps they didn't actually have that foreknowledge, but by creating the perception that they did, they forced the Allies to cancel or modify operations, achieving strategic objectives without actually knowing Allied plans in advance. Dr. Whitmore found this theory compelling but troubling. If true, it meant the Germans had developed psychological warfare capabilities of extraordinary sophistication, using cryptography not primarily as a tool for secure communication, but as a weapon for manipulating enemy decision-making. It also meant that Allied intelligence services had fallen for the deception, had been manipulated into creating their own crisis through their reactions to messages that were perhaps designed specifically to provoke those reactions. It was a level of psychological warfare sophistication that was almost admirable in its ruthlessness, if true. But the disappearance of Allied units was real, not psychological. 17 groups and individuals had genuinely gone silent, stopped communicating, vanished from operational networks. If there was no German intelligence penetration, what explained those disappearances? Investigation of the specific cases revealed a disturbing pattern. In several instances, units had been ordered to change communication procedures or modify operations immediately after the first mysterious transmission was decoded. These changes, implemented as security measures to prevent German exploitation of compromised information, had disrupted established communication protocols and operational plans. Some units, following new procedures incorrectly or incompletely, had inadvertently isolated themselves from communication networks. Others had modified operations in ways that placed them in more dangerous situations than originally planned. Still, others had been ordered to cease communications entirely pending security reviews, creating the appearance of disappearance when, in fact, they were simply following orders. In other words, the Allied response to the perceived German intelligence penetration had itself created many of the problems attributed to that penetration. By changing procedures hastily, by increasing security restrictions, by disrupting established communication networks, Allied intelligence services had caused some of their own units to effectively disappear from operational oversight. The Germans might not have eliminated these units. The Allies might have accidentally isolated them through their own security responses. It was a sobering realization that added another layer to the psychological warfare theory. If the Germans could provoke Allied security services into disrupting their own operations through fear of penetration, that was arguably more effective than actually penetrating Allied organizations. By June 1943, Allied intelligence leadership faced a difficult decision. Continue investigating a possible German penetration that showed no evidence of existing, maintain heightened security measures that were disrupting operations, and accept the organizational paralysis that was spreading through intelligence services, or conclude that the mysterious transmissions were sophisticated deception operations, restore normal procedures, and accept the risk that if there actually was a penetration, relaxing security would make it easier for Germans to exploit. Both options carried significant risks. Both required acting on incomplete information and uncertain assessments. The decision ultimately was to gradually normalize operations while maintaining some enhanced security measures. The rationale was that the disruption caused by sustained heightened security was becoming more damaging than the potential risk of German exploitation. Operations couldn't be indefinitely suspended because of fear that they might be compromised. Intelligence networks couldn't function effectively if personnel were afraid to communicate with each other. At some point, assessed risks had to be accepted and operations had to continue, even with uncertainty about whether security had been compromised. This decision was controversial. Some officials believed it was reckless, that evidence of German intelligence capabilities required sustained vigilance regardless of operational costs. Others believed it was overdue, that the mysterious transmissions had succeeded in creating exactly the kind of organizational paralysis that effective deception operations are designed to produce, and that continuing to react as if there was undetectable penetration was falling for the deception. The debate reflected fundamental questions about intelligence work: how to balance security and operational effectiveness, how to respond to threats that can't be definitively confirmed or refuted, how to maintain organizational function when facing psychological warfare designed to undermine confidence and create distrust. As operations gradually normalized through summer and fall of 1943, an interesting pattern emerged. The rate of Allied unit disappearances dropped significantly. Communication networks stabilized. Intelligence operations resumed effectiveness. It was as if the crisis had simply faded away as mysteriously as it had begun. This outcome tended to support the deception theory. If there had been actual German penetration and exploitation, why would it suddenly stop being effective when Allied security measures were relaxed? The more logical explanation was that the crisis had been largely self-inflicted, created by Allied reactions to sophisticated German deception, and resolved when Allied services stopped reacting to the perceived threat. But not everyone was convinced. Some analysts noted that the apparent resolution coincided with other developments in the war: increased Allied success in signals intelligence, growing Allied air superiority that made German communications more difficult, the beginning of Allied advances in Italy that disrupted German intelligence operations. Perhaps German intelligence capabilities had been real, but were being degraded by broader military developments, not by any change in Allied security procedures. This interpretation maintained that the mysterious transmissions had represented genuine German intelligence sophistication, that the Germans had indeed penetrated Allied operations to some degree, but that changing circumstances had reduced their ability to exploit that penetration. Dr. Whitmore's final assessment, written in October 1943, acknowledged the uncertainty that would always surround the mysterious transmissions. She wrote, "We cannot definitively determine whether the April transmissions represented genuine German intelligence capabilities, sophisticated deception operations, or some combination of both. What we can conclude is that they succeeded in creating significant disruption within Allied intelligence services, whether that was their primary purpose or a secondary effect. The incident demonstrates the power of psychological warfare, particularly when targeted at intelligence organizations whose effectiveness depends on confidence in their own security. It also demonstrates our vulnerability to deception operations that exploit our legitimate security concerns and provoke reactions that may themselves be more damaging than the threat we're reacting to." The mysterious transmission stopped after the second one in May 1943. No similar messages were intercepted for the remainder of the war. This fact alone was curious. If the Germans had developed such an effective technique for disrupting Allied operations, why use it only twice? The most plausible explanation, according to later analysis, was that the technique worked best when unexpected, when Allied services didn't understand what they were facing. Once analyzed and understood, once Allied personnel realized they might be facing sophisticated deception rather than genuine intelligence penetration, the technique lost much of its psychological impact. Using it repeatedly would allow Allied cryptographers to better understand the methodology, would risk exposing whatever actual intelligence sources the Germans might have been trying to protect, and might provoke Allied countermeasures that would reduce effectiveness. In the decades after the war, historians and intelligence analysts have studied the mysterious April-May 1943 transmissions, attempting to solve the puzzle that Allied intelligence never definitively cracked during the war. German intelligence records captured after the war provide some clues but no complete answers. There are references in Abwehr and SD, German intelligence service, documents to psychological warfare operations targeting Allied intelligence services in 1943, but specific details about the mysterious transmissions are absent. Some historians believe the relevant German records were destroyed before capture, either routinely or specifically to conceal particularly sensitive operations. Others believe the transmissions might have been an unauthorized operation by a particular German intelligence unit not officially sanctioned by higher command, which would explain the lack of documentation in official records. A controversial theory proposed in the 1970s suggested the transmissions might have been an Allied operation, a deception run by British intelligence to test Allied security procedures and organizational resilience under stress. According to this theory, the mysterious transmissions were deliberately created and intercepted to see how Allied services would respond to apparent evidence of major security breaches, providing information about weaknesses in procedures and decision-making that could be addressed before facing genuine German exploitation. The disappearance of Allied units would have been unfortunate but unintended consequences of the security measures implemented during the test. This theory has never been proven and is dismissed by most historians as implausible, but it reflects the uncertainty that surrounds the entire incident. What is certain is that the mysterious transmissions had lasting impact on Allied intelligence operations. Security procedures were significantly enhanced following the incident, even after the immediate crisis passed. Cryptographic protocols were strengthened. Compartmentalization of information was increased. Procedures for responding to potential security breaches were formalized, incorporating lessons learned from the sometimes counterproductive responses in April-May 1943. Training for intelligence personnel began including instruction on recognizing and resisting psychological warfare operations targeting intelligence organizations. In these ways, whether the transmissions represented genuine German capabilities or sophisticated deception, they ultimately strengthened Allied intelligence operations by forcing improvements and increasing awareness of vulnerabilities. Dr. Eleanor Whitmore continued working at Bletchley Park through the end of the war, contributing to numerous cryptographic breakthroughs. After the war, she returned to academic life, becoming a professor of mathematics at Cambridge, though her wartime work remained classified for decades, and she could never discuss the mysterious transmissions that had consumed months of her life in 1943. In interviews conducted after the declassification of Bletchley Park's work in the 1970s, she was asked about the incident. Her response was characteristically thoughtful. "We never solved that puzzle completely. We developed theories, some more plausible than others, but absolute certainty eluded us." That's perhaps the most important lesson. In intelligence work, you often have to make decisions and take actions based on incomplete information and uncertain assessments. The challenge is to do so wisely, avoiding both complacency about potential threats and overreaction that creates its own problems. I'm not certain we navigated that challenge perfectly in 1943, but we learned from the experience, and that learning made us more effective for the remainder of the war. The 17 Allied units and individuals who disappeared from communication networks in April-May 1943 had varied fates. Most eventually re-established contact, their disappearance explained by communication difficulties, procedural confusion, or temporary operational circumstances. 3 units were confirmed to have been captured or eliminated by German forces, though whether their loss was related to the mysterious transmissions or simply the normal hazards of operating in enemy territory could never be definitively determined. 2 individuals were never accounted for, remaining on the lists of personnel missing in action, their fates unknown. The human cost of the incident, whether it represented German intelligence success or Allied organizational failure or sophisticated deception, was real and permanent. The story of the mysterious transmissions has been told in various forms over the decades since the war, each retelling emphasizing different aspects depending on the author's focus. Some accounts present it as a German intelligence triumph, demonstrating capabilities that Allied services underestimated. Other accounts frame it as a masterful deception operation, showing how psychological warfare can be as effective as actual intelligence penetration. Still, others treat it as a cautionary tale about organizational psychology, illustrating how intelligence services can be manipulated into disrupting their own operations through fear and uncertainty. All of these interpretations have merit, and the truth likely involves elements of each. What makes the incident particularly intriguing for historians is the way it illustrates the hidden dimensions of warfare. The battles fought not with weapons, but with information, psychology, and organizational manipulation. World War II is remembered primarily for its massive conventional battles, the industrial mobilization, the strategic bombing campaigns, the naval warfare across multiple oceans. But underneath those visible conflicts was an invisible war fought by intelligence services, cryptographers, deception specialists, and psychological warfare experts. This invisible war determined the outcomes of many visible battles, provided commanders with information that shaped their decisions, and occasionally created crises that disrupted operations more effectively than conventional military action could have achieved. The mysterious transmissions of April-May 1943 represent a particularly pure example of this invisible warfare. No shots were fired, no bombs were dropped, no territory changed hands, yet Allied operations were significantly disrupted. Organizational effectiveness was reduced, and 17 units effectively disappeared from operational networks. If this was a German operation, and we can never be entirely certain it was, it demonstrated remarkable return on investment. 2 radio transmissions, probably requiring relatively little resource investment, created weeks of disruption within Allied intelligence services and forced changes in procedures that affected operations for months. From a purely analytical perspective, it was an extraordinarily efficient operation, regardless of who actually conducted it or what their precise objectives were. Modern intelligence services study the incident as an example of how sophisticated adversaries can exploit the organizational characteristics of intelligence communities. Intelligence organizations depend on trust, on confidence in their own security, on effective communication between units. Attacking these foundations, creating doubt about security, fostering distrust between personnel, disrupting communication procedures, can degrade effectiveness more efficiently than trying to actually penetrate the organization or eliminate its personnel. The mysterious transmissions, whether by design or accident, accomplished this kind of organizational attack, and the lessons remain relevant to contemporary intelligence operations facing adversaries with sophisticated psychological warfare capabilities. The incident also raises fascinating questions about the nature of deception and truth in intelligence work. If the German transmissions convinced Allied services that their security had been compromised, even if it actually hadn't been, was that deception successful, even though the threat it portrayed was false? If Allied reactions to the perceived threat caused more disruption than actual German intelligence penetration would have caused, did it matter whether the penetration was real? These questions blur the lines between deception and reality in ways that are philosophically interesting and operationally significant. In intelligence work, perceptions can matter as much as reality, and adversaries who understand this can achieve objectives without possessing the actual capabilities they appear to demonstrate. In the end, the mysterious transmissions of 1943 remain partially unexplained. We have theories, some well-supported, others speculative. We have documented consequences: the investigation, the security changes, the unit disappearances, the organizational disruption. We have the cryptographic analysis that revealed some of the message's contents while leaving other aspects mysterious. But we don't have certainty about who created these transmissions, what their precise purpose was, or whether they represented genuine intelligence capabilities or brilliant deception. That uncertainty is itself significant. It demonstrates the fog of war in its intelligence dimension, showing how even sophisticated analysis by brilliant minds working with advanced techniques can fail to penetrate the concealment and deception that characterize intelligence warfare. For those personnel who experienced the crisis firsthand, the cryptographers analyzing the transmissions, the security officials investigating possible penetration, the commanders making difficult decisions about operations that might be compromised, the experience was profoundly unsettling. They faced a threat they couldn't fully understand, couldn't definitively confirm or refute, couldn't effectively counter with conventional security measures. They had to continue operating despite fundamental uncertainty about whether their communications were secure, whether their plans were known to the enemy, whether their organizations had been penetrated in ways they couldn't detect. That kind of uncertainty is perhaps the most effective form of psychological warfare, not convincing the enemy of a specific false reality, but making them uncertain about what reality is, undermining confidence in their own knowledge and capabilities. The legacy of the mysterious transmissions extends beyond their immediate impact in 1943. They influenced how Allied intelligence services thought about security, deception, and psychological warfare for the remainder of World War II and into the Cold War. They demonstrated that technical sophistication in cryptography could be weaponized not just for secure communication, but for psychological operations targeting adversary intelligence services. They showed that organizational characteristics of intelligence communities, their dependence on trust and confidence in security, could be exploited as vulnerabilities. And they provided a case study in how to, and how not to, respond to potential security breaches when definitive information is unavailable and decisions must be made under uncertainty. Today, more than 80 years after those mysterious transmissions were intercepted, we can study the incident with historical perspective, access to declassified records, and the benefit of knowing how the larger war developed. But we cannot solve the puzzle completely. The truth remains elusive, hidden behind layers of security classification that may no longer exist, concealed by time that has claimed most of the individuals who might have known the full story, obscured by the inherent secrecy of intelligence operations that leave incomplete records, even for historians decades later. Perhaps that's appropriate, a story about mysteries and deception and uncertainty remaining itself mysterious, deceptive, and uncertain even after all these years. What we can say with confidence is that the mysterious transmissions of April-May 1943 represent a fascinating and disturbing episode in the intelligence war within World War II. Whether they were German intelligence triumph, Allied deception operation, psychological warfare masterpiece, or something else entirely, they demonstrated capabilities and approaches that were ahead of their time, that remain relevant to contemporary intelligence operations, and that remind us that some of the most effective operations in warfare are those that create disruption not through force, but through information, psychology, and the exploitation of organizational vulnerabilities. The code that turned allies into ghosts wasn't magic or supernatural. It was sophisticated application of cryptography, psychology, and organizational understanding in ways that achieved strategic effects through invisible means. And perhaps the most important lesson is that in intelligence warfare, perception and reality can become so intertwined that distinguishing between them becomes impossible, and adversaries who understand this can achieve objectives that conventional capabilities could never accomplish. Thank you for watching this exploration of one of World War II's most mysterious intelligence operations. The story of the mysterious transmissions of 1943 reminds us that warfare has dimensions beyond conventional battles, that psychological operations can be as effective as military action, and that some historical mysteries resist definitive solution even decades later. If this story intrigued you, please like and subscribe for more content exploring the hidden dimensions of military history. Share this video to help spread awareness of the invisible wars fought by intelligence services and cryptographers whose work shaped the outcomes of visible conflicts. What other mysterious incidents from World War II should we investigate? Let us know in the comments. And remember, in intelligence warfare, the most effective operations are often those that remain mysterious, that create disruption through uncertainty, and that blur the line between deception and reality in ways that keep historians debating decades later.